Anticipation of a Supreme Court decision which will, in all likelihood, legalize same-sex marriage throughout the U.S. But even if it doesn't, even if by some miracle the Supreme Court doesn't, and it allows states to make the decision for themselves, the momentum of things right now are such that all states will eventually have it. I mean, in one way or another, it's going to be the law of the land. So the discussion really about what the church faces or what the future is with this is necessary no matter what the Supreme Court's decision is. So today, we had talked a little bit about the various costs to society when this does happen. Today I want to discuss a little bit about the spiritual costs. We've talked financial, we've talked moral. What I've given you here today to start with, a discussion about various biblical terms that are used for sexual sins. And then just the biblical witness of that, and then a little discussion afterwards about what this means. So just to start with spiritual costs, the following passages are 4 Greek words used repeatedly. In the New Testament, when the New Testament talks about sexual immorality, these are the terms that it uses most often. Now, often in the debate I have had with folks over this, the argument is always, well, that's just your interpretation, or the Greek can be read in a number of different ways. I've given you the Greek here. Whether you know Greek or not doesn't matter. But a little background of each Greek word so that you understand what it is saying and what word is being used in case you're ever in an argument with somebody that says, well, it doesn't really say that. No, actually it does. So 4 Greek words the New Testament uses when it discusses immorality. Porneia, the first one. A word originally that had to do with prostitution, eventually took on the general meaning of sexual immorality. So porneia is the word where we get pornography from in English. And it's kind of the same use today as it was back then in the first century. It simply means, something dirty. It can be, they had pornography. In fact, Pompeii, in Paul's day, was a cesspool of pornography. The artwork from everything from, they have found chimes that were hanging in people's homes that were pornographic. Open public artwork throughout the city depicting various pornographic scenes, including homosexuality. Bathhouses, it was just everywhere from one side of Pompeii to the other. It's no wonder God swallowed up Pompeii with a volcano. But at any rate, porn was a big part of first century immorality. As in fact, I would say it is again. And now it comes into the homes through the internet, even uninvited. Just bang, something is there in front of you before you know what you clicked on. The next word, moikia, refers to adultery or sexual acts with someone who is not one's spouse. I've been asked sometimes about the word adultery. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Doesn't that just mean you shouldn't cheat on your spouse when you're married? Because the word adultery has to do with marriage. There's a kernel of truth to that. The word adultery did, in fact, originally mean cheating on your spouse, having intercourse with someone who is not your spouse. The word, however, broadened in its meaning by the time that Jesus was using it and Paul was using it in the first century. Both of them used this term. And it applies to any sexual activity outside of the bond of marriage by their time. It doesn't just mean cheating on your spouse. So it may have at one point in time, it didn't when Paul was using it. The next term, akatharsia, literally means impurity or dirt, refuge, a more general term that has several uses. When used for immorality, it takes on a similar meaning to the English word dirty. It may be found with porneia as a further descriptor of sexual impurity in connection to the uncleanness of idolatry. Its most common use is in connection with demons as an adjective, that is, unclean spirits. It's funny, demons are called dirty spirits. And there's definitely sexual connotations to that. They encourage dirtiness. In every context and with every meaning, though, the basic thought is that it is contrary to the purity of God. So kind of like we use the word, that's dirty, sexually. They had exactly the same term. Next one, aslegia. It's a term for sexual excess, carries the meaning of licentiousness or debauchery, lacking moral restraint. It's not used as much as the other terms, but it is used. So now some examples of how these terms might be used in the New Testament. From Matthew 15, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, and the word is moikia, that's the one that originally meant cheating on your spouse, but now meant any immorality. Sexual immorality, porneia, theft, false witness, slander, these are what defile a person. And notice these things come out of the heart. They aren't put into the heart. That's worth noting. It's not what's outside us that defile us, it's what's inside us that feeds on the stuff that's outside us. If we didn't have that in us to start with, we wouldn't be attracted to it in the first place. 2 Corinthians 12, I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, akatharsia, dirtiness, sexual immorality, porneia, and sensuality, aslegia, that they have practiced. He says this in Corinth. Corinth was another cesspool of a place. Corinth had a temple. In fact, back up. Corinth was founded by, in about 800 BC by a group called the Dorians. The Dorians are responsible for founding Corinth, Sparta, and I think Athens. But the Dorians are best known for having promoted homosexuality. They were openly practicing homosexuals. They founded Corinth. Corinth was literally a sexual tourist spot. They had sexual tourism back then. Before Paul's day, there was a temple to Diana in Corinth that boasted of having 1,000 temple prostitutes. There are actually records of a winner of an Olympic game, I think it might have even been a triathlon, having donated 100 temple prostitutes to Corinth to help out there. Plato, in the book The Republic, actually talks about Corinthian girls as a term for, those are the dirty girls, the girls that'll do whatever you want. So Corinth had a huge reputation as being a center of immorality, sexual perversion. And Paul, when he addresses Corinth, uses all three terms in a row here because it was so immersed in it all. In fact, remember what one sin Paul addressed in Corinth, a sexual sin that he didn't anyplace else? Remember from your readings? What one sin did he have to talk about to the Corinthian church that he didn't to any other church? Incest. Even within the congregation at Corinth, they had problems with incest. It's been reported among you that a man has his mother, has his father's wife. The Corinthian congregation didn't react well to that either. They turned a blind eye to it. They didn't deal with it. And Paul had to tell them, you're turning a blind eye is not good. So Corinth was an awful place for immorality. So here he's talking about mourning for those who have given themselves over to this pervasive sort of thing. Galatians 5. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, etc., etc. I warn you beforehand that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Sexual immorality is damaging to the soul. And just the fact that everybody is doing it does not in any way, shape, or form lessen the damage this does to the soul. Those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. It's not just that those who do such things once, it's those who persist in such things. You remember Mary Magdalene, in fact, was a prostitute before her conversion. It's never held against her after her conversion, and she's fully forgiven and redeemed. But had she continued in her prostitution, it would have been against her in the judgment. So those who do such things, those who continue to do such things, will not inherit the kingdom of God. And again, it's not just the act, it's the thought. It's engaging the senses in this stuff. Ephesians 4, now I say and testify in the Lord that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their mind. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, due to the hardness of their heart. They have become callous, they have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. But that's not the way you learn Christ. Sex was the problem back then, even in Ephesus. His critique of the world around the Ephesians was they've given themselves over to this dirtiness, this sexual licentiousness. He might as well have been talking to our culture. And again, everybody was doing it back then. Christian morality was really a radical morality. The normal standard operating procedure of the world in Paul's day was very open sexually, including homosexuality. It was very prevalent. In fact, it was a given that a Roman male would have had sex with other males, either slaves or through pederast relationships with young boys especially. That was a Roman thing. And it was perfectly acceptable socially. A lot of the converts that Paul would have had among the Romans would have engaged in homosexual acts, especially the males. Female homosexuality, not quite so much accepted in Paul's day, but male homosexuality was a given. So he's talking into a culture that is going exactly where ours is, and it was radical, what he was saying. It was breaking with everything the world was doing and setting Christians up for trouble. Ephesians 5, for you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral, porneia, impure, in other words, dirty, or who is covetousness, that is an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Notice again here the link between sexual immorality and idolatry. This occurs in several of the passages we've read. They go hand in hand as Paul lists them. These things are never just kind of isolated problems. There's idolatry, and this is a symptom of a broader idolatry. Hebrews 13:4, let marriage be held in honor among all, let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. Jude, for certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality, and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. They use the gospel to excuse their licentiousness. One doesn't have to look too far to see Christian churches doing this. Jesus has saved us. In fact, the United Church of Christ. This is kind of one of their platforms. Do you know that the United Church of Christ just recently sued the state of, it may have been Oklahoma, I could be wrong on that one though, but they just sued the state because the state passed a bill against same-sex marriage? The United Church of Christ suing for homosexual marriage. They are not Christian when they're doing that. Revelation 21. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. The harshest law, the clearest threats of hell in the New Testament are aimed at sexual immorality. and the world is immersed in it. Remember one of our LYF trips to London, in fact, one of the first ones we took when we went to England with the LYF, standing at a subway platform and waiting for the subway to come, and plastered up on the opposite wall of the tube there in London was this huge, it had to be 40-foot long image of two women laying on top of each other for some commercial for perfume, I think it was, or something. And here's the whole youth group kind of lined up there looking at the thing, and you just can't escape it. And it's particularly bad in Europe, but we're not too far behind Europe. All right, any thoughts on the verses before we start looking at them a little bit more here? All right, now page 2. Note the same thoughts come from the pen of Matthew, Paul, Jude, and John. They show the essential danger of improper sexual expression. So this is not just Paul, as the accusation is sometimes. Jesus himself warned against adultery. It was Jesus that said, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus expands adultery to include the thoughts, not just the act. What this demonstrates, how one conducts oneself sexually, it should be, is a reflection of one's life with God. God does care about how we conduct ourselves sexually too. This isn't an open question with God. As Christians, there is a chastity that reflects the purity of Christ that's to be practiced in our lives. Improper sexual expression is dangerous to the soul. We're not just being prudes when we say that there's a problem with our family members who are engaged in this, or other kids that we know and care about, or adults for that matter. It always amazes me when I bump into 70-plus-year-olds who are living together with their girlfriends. It's age blind. Or, for that matter, when you go to the care center and see some 80-year-old sitting there with a Playboy. I've seen that too. It knows no age. So improper sexual expression is dangerous to the soul at any age. The variety of terms for sexual immorality show there's a problem with any sexual contact. And contact maybe isn't the right word there. Any sexual expression, any sexual, beyond just the act, the thought as well, outside of the marriage of a man to a woman. Now, the reason I bring all this up again is that in this whole redefinition of marriage thing, one of the underlying truths to it all is this is not just redefining marriage, this is redefining sexuality. This is redefining what is proper in terms of any sexual expression. When this wins, Christianity will almost be in the status it was in Rome, was being a forbidden religion. Because Christianity is going to stand up and say that whether or not this is legal, it is utterly immoral and it's condemning people to hell. And we will be seen as haters of humanity as soon as we start saying that. We already are, but it'll be worse. And that was the charge against the early Christians in Rome, haters of humanity. Way marriage is being redefined. I came across an article yesterday. I want to read a paragraph of it to you. This is an article about the same-sex marriage thing. The difference between what's happening now with it and what happened in Paul's day. Remember, they had same-sex marriage in Paul's day. This is not a new thing. Nero was married to two different dudes. One who played the female. He dressed her up. She was a cross. I said she. Now I'm doing it. He was a cross-dresser who dressed like a woman. Nero called his queen. he was a slave to start with, who was castrated to arrest his male development. So his whole life was devoted to playing the woman to Nero. Nero was also then later married to another guy who was the male part in the marriage. So actually he had a three-way marriage, and Nero was both acting as a woman with the male husband and as a man with the female version. So what's happening is nothing new. This was actually a public wedding. There's still records of it. There were actually prayers for Nero and his new wife to be fruitful and have children. When they figure that one out, that would be something. So this isn't new. There's nothing new under the sun, the push for gay marriage. The difference, though, between gay marriage in Rome in Paul's day and gay marriage today is that in Paul's day, there was no attack on traditional marriage. It wasn't an attempt to redefine the entire institution and punish those who stood by the traditional man-woman marriage. In our day, it is. In our day, they are not just seeking to allow homosexuals to marry. They are seeking to redefine marriage and punish those who will stand by traditional marriage. Here's a quote from this article I came across. It says, but if you had bothered to read the fine print, you would have seen it. Changing marriage beyond recognition has long been a stated goal of the organization Beyond Marriage, which is a collection of several hundred gay rights lawyers, law professors, and activists. They argue that same-sex marriage is merely the first step on a path to redefining the family itself. Ultimately, they want legal protection for a host of other relationships, including, as they delicately put it, queer couples who decide jointly to create and raise a child with another queer person or couple in two households, and committed loving households in which there is more than one conjugal partner. This group is not a collection of cranks. It includes professors from Georgetown, Harvard, Emory, Columbia, and Yale. The Beyond Marriage Project has at least as much elite support today as the entire same-sex marriage movement had in the 1990s. This is just the first step in an entire redefining of marriage itself. The frightening thing is the effects this is going to have on kids. It's pushed as an individual's right. And what's ignored is the children raised in this are going to be devastated on every level. Morally, spiritually, emotionally, they're going to be basket cases. So it is the goal of this movement to redefine marriage itself. And I'm not sure what this would look like. Queer couples who decide jointly to create and raise a child with another queer person or couple in two households. It's like the kid is going to bounce back and forth between various homosexual families and never really belong to any one of them. You think there's a problem now with children who feel abandoned by fathers who aren't with a deadbeat dad syndrome or something. Imagine if both your parents basically abandon you. And you're just kind of floating around because nobody really wants to claim you as their own. All right, back to the handout. Ways marriage is being redefined. One, the same-sex thing, as of course we've said. So marriage is not being between a man and a woman, but between any partners of any sex. Which, here too, how do you determine what a person's sex is? You would think it would be an objective standard to that. Test the chromosomes, male or female. Miriam had a questionnaire at Iowa State recently that I wanted a copy of. I should have thought at the time to get it. I didn't. Where the gender, what gender are you section had over 20 choices. It's in Iowa State. What were some of the choices again? Cisgendered. Yeah. Yeah, whatever that is. Yeah. What was the Q thing? LGBTQ? What was it? It's not queer. It's what is it? Quasi-gendered. Yeah, they've got all these great terms now. You know, this too is symptom of something more profoundly disturbing. And that is a move, and we've talked about this in so many other things, a move from objective standards of truth to totally subjective standards. There is no longer an identifiable truth. It's now whatever you created in your own mind becomes truth. Even your gender. In fact, this was argued in the Supreme Court, and one of the Supreme Court justices, the new one, took this line of reason that gender is whatever you want it to be. Gender is a matter of self-identification, not of anything biologically factual. Have you seen the New York chapter chair of the NAACP and the trouble she's in right now? It's not really trouble, but it's controversy. It's a white woman who was raised as a white girl, and they have pictures of her as white as can be, identifying herself as a black person because she's the chapter head of the NAACP in New York. And some people are saying, wait, that's a foul because she's obviously white, calling herself black, and the NAACP is defending her. Race doesn't matter. You can, whatever race you identify in is the race you are. There is no objective truth. It's all you define your own reality. Therefore, there's also no lying. As long as you identify that as your reality, that is your reality, and who's to say differently? This is the insane kind of world we live in. So, where were we? Yeah, so the same-sex marriage thing again, the who you are marrying who the other person is no longer defined in any objective terms. It's whoever you think you are is who you are. So Bruce Jenner can think he's a woman, even though, according to his chromosomes, he will always be a male, and you cannot change that. Even if you change yourself physically, we can start calling him a woman because he thinks he is. 2, rise of cohabitation and disregard for marriage as an institution. We should have seen this coming. The same-sex thing is just the next step in an older problem, and that is people simply disregarding marriage at all. What do you need it for? Why not just live together? Well, what cohabitation does is it takes the responsibility out of that partnership. It takes the pledge of monogamy out of that partnership. Now it becomes a relationship of convenience. But what if it's cohabitation without sex? So somebody comes to me and says, we're living together. I say, that's wrong. They say, but we're not having sex. So problem solved, right? What's the answer to that? No, that's correct. It's a bad witness. As one of my professors at the SEM put it, even if it's no longer a sin of adultery, it's still a sin of deception. And it's a sin of a horrible Christian witness. Because there's, especially with little kids, you can take some kind of bizarre, rational, gymnastic type approach with an adult and rationalize it all away. But a little kid, you're acting like husband and wife. You're living together, you're conducting yourselves as husband and wife, and you're not married, and that kid doesn't see any difference between you doing that and a couple who actually is married. And they don't know about sex. Tell them we're not having sex, that isn't going to mean anything to a little kid. All they know is you're going to be a mommy and daddy because you're married, and so are they, and that's what couples do. It's not just a bad witness, it's actually deceiving people and leading them away from Christ. Yes? Yeah. Exactly. Taking trips as couples. And then the same argument, well, we're not going to sleep together. So what? It's not just the point, is it? There's a witness involved in how others perceive it, and perception does matter when you're a Christian. So the cohabitation thing, Christians need to conduct themselves differently. And just because you take the sex out of it does not necessarily mean the witness is still true to what being a Christian is. 3, prominence of deadbeat parents. Again, you should have seen this coming. Of course, marriage is going to fall apart when our whole approach to marriage is haphazard at best. It becomes a thing of convenience. Growing call for polygamy. From the same article. Let's see if I can find that quick. The polygamy thing is, in fact, already beginning to be the next phase of the debate. It's closer up the front. They are, in fact, already calling for, if 2 people of the same sex can marry, why not 3 people? Why not 4 people? And in fact, that has certain cultural precedent. Under Jewish law, polygamy is permitted. Under certain circumstances in Jewish law, the Mishnah, the Jewish explanation of Old Testament law, actually says that if a woman does not produce a child within 10 years, the male must marry again. He must produce an heir. So there are certain cases in Judaism where polygamy is demanded, not just suggested or permitted. Yeah, I can't find it. But at any rate, that is the next frontier. Expect it to come to that. Marriage without intent of monogamy. Here's the big part of the redefinition of marriage. Implicit within the Christian marriage vow is exclusivity to that other person you are with. They're yours exclusively. And in a very different way than either Roman culture or Jewish culture held at the time. In Roman culture, the woman was the exclusive property of the male, but the male was not the exclusive property of the woman. He was free to have various sexual trysts as he wanted, and still, in Roman sense, be true to the marriage vow. In Jewish culture, again, polygamy only went one way. It was one man with his up to 4 women. Actually, that's a Muslim tradition. A man can have up to 4 women. I'm not sure there's a number put on it with the Jews. But it's one man and multiple women. So it always goes one way. The woman has no rights over the man exclusively, but the man does have exclusive rights over the woman. In Christianity, Paul comes along, and again to the Corinthians, he says that the woman does not have authority over her body, the man does, and the man does not have authority over his body, the woman does. He makes them equal in the partnership to where they both have authority over the other. They both have exclusive rights to the other. So that's a uniquely Christian idea. Here's another quote from that article. A dirty little secret about gay marriage: most gay couples are not monogamous. Well, we have come to accept lately, partly thanks to Lisa Mundy's excellent recent cover story in The Atlantic, and partly because we desperately need something to make the drooping situation of heterosexual marriage seem vibrant again, that gay marriage has something to teach us, that gay couples provide a model for marriages that are more egalitarian and less burdened by older gender roles that are weighing down marriage these days. So in other words, a little cheating now and then is healthy for a marriage. In fact, there's a new term you will hear more of called monogamish. Not monogamous, monogamish. So that once a year, go off, have a little affair. It makes for healthy marriage. This is part of the whole redefinition process of marriage. Exclusivity is no longer the norm. Next one, marriage without the intent of lifelong commitment, temporary marriage. Yeah, which kind of leads, what do you think about prenuptial agreements? Because that, doesn't that kind of carry an implicit, there's a good chance this isn't going to work out, so let's have this prenuptial arrangement in place when it falls apart mentality? What do you think about prenuptial agreements? I think I can see one way where it might be okay. If a couple, say, especially later in life, was getting married, and they both have kids, and the kids, say, are looking negatively at the marriage because that means now they have to share the inheritance with another group of siblings and they really don't want to do it, and you want to keep family conflict to a minimum, I could see a prenup in that case to where both of them say, look, when we die, what I brought into this marriage, my kids get, and this isn't going to be split up. That way, then there would be less family anxiety for inheritance reasons. I can see something like that. But I think the prenups, especially among the rich, of when this thing breaks apart, this is all you get. I think even that says something extremely negative about the idea of... Yeah, you could handle that with a will. Yeah, maybe. You could probably handle that with a will too. I think you're right. Yeah. All right, question, next one. Why isn't a civil union good enough for the proponents of same-sex marriage? If the argument is we just want to protect the rights of gay couples, you can do that. And some states have done that with a civil union. They just don't call it marriage. It's the same rights as a marriage. It's just not called marriage. So why not civil unions if you were a gay couple? Because you what? You don't have the title of marriage. Because it's not just about civil rights. It's about social acceptance. The Supreme Court actually says this word for word, Supreme Court of Iowa, when they permitted homosexual marriage. It's like a, 60-page ruling or something. I've read it. They say in there that it's not just about granting the civil rights and protection, that the word marriage carries with it a certain social acceptance that the courts want to see with homosexual couples. So again, the courts are trying to force social acceptance of sexual taboos on culture. It's stated right in their ruling that that's what they're about, which the courts, frankly, should have absolutely nothing to do with. Their concern should be only with the letter of the law, not with what's morally acceptable to the masses and trying to force something new on society. What will the results be of redefining marriage? One, it'll create a sense of security for those living contrary to God's design. And all those passages we read clearly show that when one's sexual life is messed up, one's life with God is messed up. Our first concern with this whole debate is not that it's going to simply redefine marriage. The first concern is this is going to put people's souls in danger because it's going to give an appearance of permissibility to something that to God is totally forbidden. It's going to make people comfortable in disobedience to God, and it's going to actually help them go to hell. That's our number one concern with the issue. So it creates a sense of security, of acceptance, of permittableness, even though to God it will always be against His will. Two, Genuine Christianity will become more and more hated as an unloving religion. 3, hate crime and discrimination laws will be applied to those who refuse to recognize same-sex marriages, even to the point of speaking against it. A Canadian pastor has already been arrested for preaching that homosexuality is a sin. The courts later let him go, but the strategy is to silence the opposition, which you don't have to win in the courts to do. All you have to do is line up a dozen people willing to file a lawsuit, and that individual has to defend himself against each one of those dozen. So it costs the first guy, each person in the dozen line, it costs them X amount of dollars to file the lawsuit, but it's going to cost that one who's defending himself 12 times 12. That's the strategy. Destroy your enemy. And that is exactly what's going to happen to the church. I guarantee it. And to pastors. They don't have to win in the courts. All they have to do is sue and break you financially. And if you've got a dozen suits to defend yourself against, they will break you financially. So, 4, pastors will have to cease being agents of the state. No more marriages in the church. Somebody told me that this is already happening in places in Europe where the marriage happens in the courthouse and then the church will have some kind of service afterwards to celebrate it, but no more marriage in the church. And that's a very real possibility. We got to stop there because I'm out of time. Anybody have a question because we don't have much time? All right. We will finish our discussion next week on this. And that's kind of where we'll pick it up, is what next for the church. Because we are going to have to answer this sooner than we want. Yeah. You'll come and visit me? Thanks. That's nice. That was a deer? It was a deer. Yeah. Oh. Poor little guy. Wow, I hope he's all right. All right, let's close.